Hi, this is Abel Stewart, and welcome back to Grace Workshop. So we are in week 5, our last week, and I really enjoyed this journey with y'all. I think it's been a very rich exploring of what is God's grace and how does that apply to our lives. So, quick review of our tools so far. Quick review. We had what is grace? We talked about prevenient grace that prevents us from harm. We talked about justifying grace that helps us to measure up for God's purposes for our lives. We talked about sanctifying grace, the rust dissolver, the degunker of our heart that cleans us up spiritually. And we talked about the stud finder, individual practices of piety or spiritual maturity, that which helps us to grow more spiritually mature as individuals. So God finding what's solid within us so we can build on that. We talked about community practices of piety, that which helps us grow in spiritual maturity as a community, that which binds us together in that process, zip ties, right? And we talked last week about individual practices of mercy, putting that faith into action. We had our multi-tool. We talked about spiritual gifts, and we talked about talents and how you use those creatively to develop new kinds of ministry for God's glory on an individual level. So today we're talking about that in a community level, of community putting faith into action and spiritual maturity in action. And our tool for that is the blueprint, the plans basically, right? So the blueprint, and how does that reflect that? A plan or blueprint helps us to know what tools are needed. So as we have the individual tools, we have the individual practices of mercy and piety and spiritual maturity and all that. This is what brings it all together, the plan or blueprint, and coordinates that towards a common goal and a common purpose for God's glory, right? So community practices of mercy. To quote the Lego movie, I'm showing my generation of parenting here. To quote the Lego movie, sometimes we need to follow the instructions. Yes, all right. So community practices are works of mercy. Now, this inevitably gets into politics. Ugh. So disclaimer, please hear me on this, because we will talk about some political things, right? Good, bad, or otherwise, politics is the process of human consensus building, organizing people toward a common goal. That is politics, good, bad, or otherwise. Now, what that purpose or goal is, that's another question. And granted, there are questionable politics, heaven knows, right? My point is this: as we talk about community, spiritual maturity, and action, that consensus building is toward ultimately God's kingdom purposes. We're talking God's kingdom politics here. So hear me in that, please. And don't immediately bristle, oh, he's going to talk politics. Give me a fair hearing, please. That's what I'm asking. All right. So what are God's kingdom politics? Let's start there as a foundation. First of all, the first will be last, the last will be first. The greatest will become the servant. Philippians 2. That is our model of God's kingdom politics. Jesus, as Paul says, had the same mind that was in Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, even to death on the cross. When I talk about God's kingdom politics, I'm talking about that. We are building consensus toward that, toward taking up our cross, toward dying to self, giving our lives in service to others for God's glory, of emptying ourselves for God's greater good. Okay? So hear me. Yes, we're talking politics, but that's the context. Okay? Good. All right. I will say this. There is no place here for pride or selfishness. That sometimes mark human politics. That's not what God's kingdom politics are about. So if that's, sometimes where we go with politics, hear me. That's not where I'm coming from here. Okay. Seeking justice. That is the first one that Wesley mentions of community works of mercy. Seeking justice. So right now, we are deeply grieving as a society the ongoing presence of racial injustice. It's just something that's really fresh on our hearts right now. We're in a season of deep soul searching here in the U.S. with George Floyd, with all that's happened in recent months. The question might be asked, are we soul searching deeply enough? It's a question. I think there's more wrestling probably that it is to be done on that. But one way or another, there is a growing realization that things may not be as fair to some members of our society as we thought they were. I think that's a fair statement, right? So you're with me so far. So the thing is, we say, well, all are created equal. Sometimes we need to be careful with that statement. My understanding of equality might not be the same as someone else's understanding of equality. So even then, there's a need for dialogue and maturity in that. Where am I going with all of this? What that means, if there is a structural inequality of power, that's what I'm talking about here, structural inequality of power, a very large part of the responsibility for ensuring fairness falls to those who have a greater power. That's what I'm saying. So what that means is, if in the existing status quo, I have more resources, I have more access, I have more options, if there's an unfair situation, I also have a greater burden of responsibility to use those resources and means and access that I have to try to make that right. That's what I'm talking about. That's where I'm coming from here, related to seeking justice. So it is political, but I think it's also something as Christians we need to recognize under that Philippians 2 model. That's really, we need to take that seriously. I will say this. It's counterintuitive to how the world often works. That is our call as Christians, though. Gustavo Gutierrez had a really good point in his book, We Drink from Our Own Wells. And he states that unless spiritual transformation comes before social transformation, then what ends up happening is the oppressed and the oppressors might trade places, but ultimately nothing really changes. Why is that? If I'm the oppressed and I don't learn to love my enemy, if I then become the one in power, I'm going to take revenge against the one who hurt me before, my enemy. That spiritual transformation has to come first. It just does. That is the foundation for meaningful, lasting, and healthy social transformation, is first having that spiritual transformation before that. I will say this, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of maturity, and it takes a whole lot of work. There's not a shortcut to that, and I wish I could say there was an easy road towards working toward justice, working toward having that healthy social dynamic. It's not an easy road or a simple one, but the alternative is just to let that dysfunction remain. That's not good for anyone. As Christians, we're called to that God's kingdom politics, consensus building. Let's focus our effort and energy and time toward that. That is what we're called to do. It just is. Wesley also mentions ending oppression and discrimination. If the raw material of this world shapes eternity, remember we talked about the new creation back in our first week, then the social systems of this creation shape the social systems of the next. What do I mean by that? I mean local governments, I mean community organizations, I mean social clubs, I mean social networks. All of the social fabric of this creation, what if there was a permanence and a continuity that made up a lot of the social fabric and community in the new creation as well? What that means is, on the one hand, positive transformation that happens here may actually, in a real sense, have eternal, lasting value. That's great. That's good. That's why we want to invest the hard work and maturity and time in doing this right, because there might be really an eternal value to that. But at the same time, the idea of that permanence of what we're doing, but also it means that we can't just ignore that call and say, oh, well, there's going to be this society is going to be wiped away and a new one will take its place. That's too easy. That's too convenient. I don't think we have that option with integrity as Christians. I don't think so. Revelation 21, let's talk about that a little bit, states this, I'll quote, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." We talked about the quote from N.T. Wright. Redemption doesn't mean scrapping what's there, starting again from a clean slate, but rather liberating what has come to be enslaved. Now, I mentioned Gustavo Gutierrez and liberation theology. When I'm talking, again, we talk about politics, I'm talking liberation from sin and death. So God glorifying social transformation, That's what I'm really talking about here. So if politics is consensus building, again, God's kingdom politics means consensus building toward the reality when God lives with his people, when God will wipe away every tear from our eyes, when there will be no more death. We are building consensus toward a social reality marked by mature love in our relationships, a holy sense of vocation in our work, sacred community in our neighborhoods, those with greater political power maturely serving those who have less, and God-centered love permeating all of it. That's what I'm talking about. So it is political, but it's a God-glorifying political, I would like to think. Social redemption means liberating societal systems from their bondage to sin and death. God's kingdom politics means consensus building toward that. Now, hear me. This is not pie in the sky. This is not wishful thinking. That's a cop-out to think that. It is. It is a matter of genuinely and prayerfully seeking God's will toward societal systems that reflect God's mature love. That's it. Okay. Addressing the needs of the poor. That's another one that Wesley mentioned. It's easy to talk about consensus building toward that society building on God's mature love. It's a whole lot harder to fund it. Oh, he's talking money. Yes, he is. We got to put our money where our mouth is, and that's really what we're talking about here. So we talked about those with more power serving those with less. Part of that is seeing the wealthy sacrificially serving the poor in mature love as an extension of that. Think about this. Jesus was the wealthiest person who ever lived. Why do I say that? As God, he created the earth from nothing. Everything was his, right? And yet Jesus chose to empty himself, take the form of a servant, and die a brutal death on the cross. That model of mature love, being willing to empty itself in service of others, that's that Philippians 2 values that we're talking about. And financially, that we need to kind of think what the extension of that financially is. That's a fact on the material sense. So in Philippians 2, we talk about this. I'm not just talking the filthy rich here. Hear me with this. I'm talking any of us who have a measure of comfort beyond basic necessities. In the United States, we are really blessed with resources, and we need to take that seriously. Being rich is not wrong. Hear me in that. I'm not saying being rich. In 1 Timothy, it says, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's not money that's the root of all kinds of evil. The love of money. That's an important distinction. The fact is this, though. We need to be willing to share what we have. Failure to share out of a poverty of love in our hearts, that is wrong. So don't be materially wealthy and love poor. That's not a place of a Christian to be. All right. Think about where am I with this in the use of my resources? Do I have a poverty of love in my heart, but an abundance of wealth? Talk about talk about that with God, and just really do some soul searching. Conclusion, wrapping all of this up. How is all of this grace? That's really our point in all of this. So, Ephesians 2, 8 through 9, coming back to that. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. So ironically, we talk about this, every one of Wesley's means of grace is called works of piety, works of mercy on an individual community level. It's not works that save us, it is the gift of God's grace. But I will say this, I think Wesley still had it right. Here's what I mean by that. Those works of piety and mercy, of maturity and action, if you will, those are perhaps the ways that we can rightly come to better understand what salvation actually is. So I'll say this, they show us God's heart. They point us toward God's purposes. Works don't get us into God's kingdom. Hear me in that. Works don't get us into God's kingdom, but maybe they can help us feel a bit more at home when we get there, right? If you have struggled with purpose in your life, if you're trying to figure out who you are, why am I here? Where is all of this going? My final word to you is this. Try starting with God's grace. And you may just find that a whole lot of things start to make a whole lot more sense. Thank you. God bless you.